Okay, so what I'd like to do is read some excerpts from Thus Spoke Zarathustra and kind of respond, give my thoughts and get your thoughts, and we'll kind of try to work with manageable pieces. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, so this is of the 1,001 Goals.
Uh-huh.
Zarathustra has seen many lands and many peoples. Thus he has discovered the good and evil of many peoples. Zarathustra has found no greater power on earth than good and evil. No people could live without evaluating, but if it wishes to maintain itself, it must not evaluate as its neighbor evaluates. Much that seemed good to one people seemed shame and disgrace to another. Thus I found much that was called evil in one place was in another decked with purple honors. One neighbor never understood another. His soul was always amazed at his neighbor's madness and wickedness. A table of values hangs over every people. Behold, it is the table of its overcomings. Behold, it is the voice of its will to power. So one thing that really stands out to me here is how postmodern this really is.
Right.
Right. I mean, this is aperspectivism.
Yeah, it is.
Right? There are no ahistorical, pre-given, privileged perspectives anywhere. There is no pre-given stable truth because there is nothing but history, right? So he's got these postmodern elements here, and he's looking at this system and how, you know, in different situations, you get a different value system related to the will to power for that particular group of people.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I guess I have a different translation than yours, but
who's the translator?
This is Kaufman.
Okay, so if anything, that's better. So where does it differ?
Okay, well, just to take like the last sentence or two, he says, "A tablet of the good hangs over every people. Behold, it is the tablet of their overcomings. Behold, it is the voice of their will to power." And well, reading it, I definitely see the aperspective approach here, where the different lands and different peoples have sort of different shadings or colorings of what is good and what is evil.
Right.
And then it seems like with the tablet of the good that hangs over every people, which is the tablet of their overcomings, the voice of their will to power, it seems to me that he's talking about a sort of historical development process and how different peoples each through their will to power reached certain overcomings in that sort of historical process.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And if you look at on the next page, when he says, "Truly, my brother, if you only knew a people's need and land and sky and neighbor, you could surely divine the law of its overcomings and why it is upon this ladder that it mounts towards its hope." So that historical process has a strong element, essentially, of a response to conditions, right?
Yeah.
That what was valued, how they saw good and evil, what the path of their will to power was, emerged from their conditions.
Right.
You know, if you're at a certain period in history, you're near a body of water, you have fertile land, you have to guard it, right? So that necessitates some sort of military, for example.
Yeah.
You know? So yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely historically contingent. And when he states that, he's really stressing just how contingent it was. And it's ultimately a materialist kind of conception.
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, those conditions that have to do with what the need of the people was, the land, the sky, the neighbor, to a large degree, those are material conditions.
Right.
The land, you know, the sky, like, does it rain a lot? Does it not rain? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is the land fertile? You know?
Right.
Are their neighbors hostile? Do they have neighbors that raid them? I mean, you have whole accounts of people who actually became like a tribe of raiders because they got attacked by a tribe of raiders. There's like a whole westward movement that started in Asia with people got raided by some Mongol tribe and driven out, and they didn't know what to do, so they just imitated the people who raided them and raided the next people down the road.
Right.
And it was like a massive raider conversion process. It's like swept across Asia into Europe like a wave. Literally like a wave, in the sense that the disturbance was actually distinct from the particles over the horizontal, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
To like a certain, within a limited extent. Some people went far, I knock you out, now you go. You knock him out, now you go, blah, blah,
right.
Onward. So it emerges from the conditions.
Right.
It reminds me of something else Nietzsche said. I don't remember where he said it, but it was something like, he will become strong only if he needs to become strong.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned you were reading Jung, and Jung remarked that Nietzsche actually hadn't traveled that widely. So when he's talking about different values, different cultures, he's got to be basing that essentially on books that he's been reading.
Right.
Right? I mean, I've heard this criticism of Max Weber, too. He was just like, well, I'm going to say some things about China. Well, let me open up the encyclopedia and look up China.
Right.
But it's interesting, too, because when he talks about, he gives examples, and he says, when Nietzsche gives examples, and he says, you should always be the first to outrival all others. Your jealous soul should love no one except your friend. This precept made the soul of a Greek tremble, and following it, he followed his path to greatness. So he's talking about the ancient Greeks.
Right.
And then he says, to speak the truth and to know well how to handle bow and arrow, this seemed both estimable and hard to that people from whom I got my name, a name which is both estimable and hard to me.
Right.
Zarathustra. These are the Persians. Then he mentions to practice loyalty. Before that, to honor father and mother and to do their will even from the roots of the soul. Another people hung this table, or tablet in your translation, of overcoming over itself and became mighty and eternal with it. Clearly, he's talking about the Hebrews. That's the Fifth Commandment. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the lands that the Lord your God is giving you.
Right.
To be clear, they actually had 613 mitzvahs.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like 613 commandments. Maybe that's not the best word, but it's a lot. So it's a really rambling, intricate system.
Yeah.
And the fourth group, he talks about people who practice loyalty for the sake of loyalty, to risk honor and blood, even in evil and dangerous causes. And doing so, another people mastered itself with such teaching, and thus mastering itself became pregnant and heavy with great hope. I'm not sure who he's talking about there.
Uh-huh.
It could be Romans, or it could be like Huns, Vikings, but it's an image of cunning warriors. Yeah, I mean, all the groups that I'm seeing here, they seem like ancient peoples that he learned about in his studies.
Right. Well, yeah, in the context of Jung joking that Nietzsche didn't know much of the world, he seems to misinterpret the whole thing because, well, your analysis that he's talking about these ancient cultures and so on, it totally makes sense to me. And it also fits in with the sort of materialist and historical context in which he's writing, and about how the different cultures have these different shadings of good and evil and different types of overcomings that they will. And so, well, I spent some time with Jung's writings on Zarathustra, and that's just one example, I think, of how actually shallow his reading of Nietzsche is. It was quite shocking to me to read. Let me find the name of it. Okay, the book is called Nietzsche's Zarathustra, Notes of the Seminar given in 1934 to 1939, 2 volumes. He engages in racism and, like, for example, the points that we were just discussing about this sort of a-perspective approach to the different emphases and definitions and so on of good and evil among the many peoples. Jung simply interpreted that as that all cultures have a sense of good and evil, and therefore good and evil are archetypal. So you've got racism and this sort of reality tunnel of everything fitting into the archetypes, and basically just a shallow reading overall. And on the 1001 goals, he started off rather interesting. He linked the 1001 of the 1001 goals to the Arabian Nights and how it connotes an unthinkably high number. And then, to describe the very, different peoples with their values or goals, to describe it as having 1001 of them, he wrote that the people are basically helplessly split over all those various goals. And he wrote, because he does not know where he belongs, it is a sort of Zersplitterung, a splitting or splintering. And so he connects the 1001 goals of a people to basically a person who hasn't individuated. We could connect that to Gurdjieff's idea that we have many eyes inside us. But then Jung's next move is just to say that the person hasn't integrated their shadow, and then to move on to archetypes and so on. But one of the interesting things that he said, and this basically goes along with what Nietzsche writes later in this section, I think, is that when you have so many values or goals, then what you need in the first place is valuation to basically rank them all.
Yeah. I actually really like the connection to what is it? What is it? 1001 Nights? Is that what it's called?
Right.
Because you can think of each value as a story, and I think each night Scheherazade was supposed to tell a story, and I think that was to basically save her life.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think that was the context of it. Like she had to keep telling stories to keep from being executed or something, and that each kind of cultural matrix was like a narrative system.
Right.
And that it's also important to appreciate that there's a larger context. In terms of good and evil, it's also important to note that elsewhere Nietzsche talks about evil as also being related to slave morality and distinguishes it from like the aristocratic conception of something as bad. But the good and evil is actually something I want to talk about a little bit more after I deal with a couple more topics that I've sketched out here.
Okay.
But Jung, in making that connection, I find it fascinating that he made that connection, but it's also a little disappointing.
Yeah. The book, when I found out that Jung wrote 1,600 pages on Zarathustra, I was endlessly excited. And then I started reading it, and just this sort of almost a kind of horror struck me. But there are some very good ideas in it, and I'm going to read and finish it later. But yeah, there's a lot more garbage than I would have thought there would have been.
But I actually saw that prior, the idea of a relationship with the 1001 kind of narratives or eyes going in different directions as being related to the fourth way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that just kind of jump out at you if you have that frame of reference. But also the comment that you made that there's like an individuation process that needs to take place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Nietzsche points that out. Nietzsche actually says, as it goes on, a change in values, that means a change in the creators of values. He who has to be a creator always has to destroy. Peoples were the creators at first. Only later were individuals creators. Indeed, the individual himself is still the latest creation. And one of the things that really struck me about that is when we think about integral theory and Gebser, we think of the magic archaic state as being related to a limited perspective that's essentially narcissistic, or it's analogous to the narcissistic stage in some sense.
Right.
After the magic stage, you get the mythic stage where you begin to identify with the whole tribe.
Uh-huh.
So I thought about that. I was like, well, this is interesting because this is making it sound like, well, the tribe comes first, and then the individual comes later. And what I thought about was, I looked at it from kind of a Lacanian perspective, that the individual is different from the person who is, purely egocentric. A narcissist is actually strongly at the mercy of the tribe, of the herd, actually. In the sense that our identity, I mean, he makes another point here. He says, our conscience is related to herd identification. Joy in the herd is older than joy in the ego. Well, if you look at the mirror stage in Lacan, our identity as first encountered actually belongs to others. We see that reflection. And then there's an understanding that that reflection exists kind of in the context and the imaginations of these other people perceiving us. And that may help to kind of give a context for thinking about that and distinguishing this kind of narcissistic mirror process from actually being an individual.
Right. I have a similar take on it, but coming from a little bit of a different direction. I really like the Kaufman translation of this, so I'd like to read it and then give a little bit of my thought on it. Only man placed values in things to preserve himself. He alone created a meaning for things, a human meaning. Therefore, he calls himself man, which means the esteemer. To esteem is to create. Hear this, you creators. Esteeming itself is of all esteemed things the most estimable treasure. Through esteeming alone is their value, and without esteeming, the nut of existence would be hollow. Hear this, you creators. Change of values, that is a change of creators. Whoever must be a creator always annihilates. First peoples were creators, and only in later times individuals. Verily, the individual himself is still the most recent creation. The first thing that it made me think of was the Japanese psychoanalyst, I believe he is, Kawai Hayao. He said something like, this is just a paraphrase from poor memory, but he said something like, how monumental a shift in the history of the world was the creation of the Western ego. So he sees it as, one of those historical developments that would be basically like, the Gebser stages, or like the way that Wilber describes things. Then after reading that, I did some research on it, and many psychologists basically discuss this historical appearance of the ego and discuss it as being a quite modern thing. And so it seems, if this is what Nietzsche is talking about, it's actually quite surprising that he knew about this, but Nietzsche has a way of surprising like that.
Of being ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I've got to say, the Kaufman translation is better. The thing is I have Kaufman, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but this is Hollingdale, and it's like I've been carrying around this little penguin book, Zarathustra's Discourses, because I can fit it in my pocket, and it's nice to get out and read it, and I feel like I get the general thrust of it, but I think there's a reason that Kaufman is considered to be the top Nietzsche translator.
Yeah. So thinking about the ego as a sort of modern invention is actually, I think it should be surprising for a lot of people, because it basically seems like, in our ego psychology, it basically seems like it's just always been this way. And it's kind of interesting. There's that conservative, I guess you could call it, mindset that, you shouldn't or you can't change things because that's the way they've always been. But often you find out, if you actually try to see if that's actually the way that things have always been, you find out that it's like only been like that for, a couple of years or something. Like in Japan, you encounter a lot of that about why can't this and that in the culture be fixed. And I forgot exactly what it was. I wish I had the example, but it might be like the type of employment system that Japan has. And, you bring up a problem with it and they say, well, that's the way it's always been. But then you find out that the system was a post-war development. So always means 70 years.
Right. It's kind of like before we started the podcast, we were talking about Edward Bernays. It's kind of how, with veganism, some people will say something like, we've always had bacon and eggs for breakfast. That's just the way that we've done it. And that's actually something that Edward Bernays invented. It was like specifically, he was working for people who were moving pork bellies.
Right.
So then he promoted the idea of that hearty bacon and eggs breakfast.
Right.
It's like Zizek making the comment that you can watch movies where, and like listen to people who are futurists, where it's easier for people to envision something like human beings achieving immortality and being able to like fly across the universe than it is for like everyone to have health care. It's like, no, that's just the way it is. Like, yeah, you'll be able to live forever. You won't be able to afford it.
Yeah.
Not you.
Healthcare is a great example.
That's kind of like where the kind of the arguments that you get, like if you follow what's going on in the country now, they're saying like, this is impossible. And they're like, they do it in Sweden. Like they do it in Norway. What are you talking about? It's impossible.
Right. I mean, yeah, the healthcare in Japan is light years beyond that in the U.S. as well. That's something we should talk about another time.
Yeah, we should definitely do a podcast on that. I mean, it's kind of like there seems to basically be, you have to look at some places in Asia and some places in Central and Northern Europe that really put the lie to a lot of this nonsense.
Right.
I mean, just in terms of healthcare, trains, mathematics, it's completely ridiculous.
Yeah. Just the idea that I was sort of working to with that passage, the isolated, dependent I, the ego, is just one of those things that's a recent, development. So in that way, it's obvious. It is only one way of experiencing the world. And it's a very problem-laden way of experiencing the world.
I absolutely agree that it's a problem-laden way of experiencing the world. But also, like just looking at integral theory, you also have to take into consideration how developments really have to do with differentiations and then integrations.
Yeah,
so it experiences the ego, the separate ego experiences that affliction, but that higher level of integration is only possible through the development of the ego.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a necessary development, but it's not like we haven't, to put it in gaming terms, beaten the final boss.
No, that's absolutely the case. I mean, even going back to what we were discussing before, when you have the passage of the friend, when it says we use other people to avoid ourselves and avoid the real development of individuality. He says here, I and me are always too earnestly in conversation with one another. How could it be endured if there were not a friend? But there's also, where it says for the hermit, the friend is always the third person. The third person is the cork that prevents the conversation of the other two from sinking to the depths. That can be an avoidance technique. It can also be, like we were saying before, a type of third force that could actually allow for positive development.
Right. Yeah, I like that connection, but I'm not sure that it fits too well unless you sort of make it all a metaphor. Because like in virtually every system, and I think this includes Gurdjieff's, the third force is abstract and intangible.
Okay, that's a good point. So if you talk about the third person being there as not necessarily being the third force, but the presence of the third person actually helps to bring the third force.
Yeah. You could definitely see it as like, say, like that relationship that happens when the friend is there.
Yeah. And also going into, like you're firing your mirror neurons because there's another person there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's interesting the way Nietzsche sees friendship. Like on the one hand, it's very much like Artie Lang or Trungpa. It's like, is friendship possible? Is it all just projection or secret weaknesses that you're playing out? But then on the other hand, he sort of sees this ideal friendship where it's a dialectic of opposition towards the overman.
Yeah, absolutely. That's completely correct. And again, here he's like way really foreshadowing the postmodernists. Okay, so I want to look at this last section of the 1001 Goals or Arabian Nights. Tell me, who will subdue it for me, brothers? Tell me, who will fasten fetters upon the 1,000 necks of this beast? Hitherto there have been 1,000 goals, for there have been 1,000 peoples. only fetters are still lacking for those 1,000 necks, and one goal is still lacking. Yet tell me, my brothers, if a goal for humanity is still lacking, is there not still lacking humanity itself?
Yeah. Can I just interject and give the Kaufman translation?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. 1,000 goals have there been so far, for there have been 1,000 peoples. Only the yoke for the 1,000 necks is still lacking. The one goal is lacking. Humanity still has no goal. But tell me, my brothers, if humanity still lacks a goal, is humanity itself not still lacking too?
Okay, so I actually heard something in there that I do prefer. Can you go back to where it was talking about only the yoke is still lacking?
Yeah. Only the yoke for the 1,000 necks is still lacking. The one goal is lacking.
Right. The point being there that the yoke for the 1,000 necks is the one goal.
Yes.
See, that's not as clear in this translation.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so here I want to argue that, well, just to be clear, you agreed with me when I read the beginning of the passage that you basically have the aperspectivism of postmodernism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here I'm arguing he's going beyond postmodernism. Here we have an imperative for actually unifying humankind for one goal. It's a unification of the fragments that goes beyond postmodernism into second tier by looking at things from a unifying framework that seeks to integrate.
Right.
And I was going to say that although the language could be taken to imply subjugation, the Kaufman translation actually has a little bit less of that sense. Now, I want to think about the kind of process of the levels of the different stages. When we're at the rational stage, it can be characterized as third-person systemic. It's kind of actually seeing, really looking at the world objectively and having concepts like, for example, universal human rights, making universal observations about people. But then you have fourth-person metasystemic that looks back at what was observed at the rational stage and says, well, actually, these are different. You're universalizing, but you're universalizing from a specific perspective, right? And so it seeks to differentiate those different systems and says, no, because this is our concept of enlightenment, our concept of universal human values had a specific historical inflection on it.
Yeah.
And so there was a type of unification, but then the postmodern comes along and it differentiates it. And it differentiates it in the context of aperspectivism, which creates a kind of egalitarianism because you're not privileging any perspective.
Right.
Right? And then, of course, we see the negative political ramifications of that through retribalization. But then, so we have third-person systemic, then we have fourth-person metasystemic, rational, postmodern, then we get to second tier, where we have fifth-person, unified framing in a broader context, the idea of it being paradigmatic, where a paradigm has a certain injunction. Mm-hmm. And so if you follow the injunction, then that in some sense tells you you'll have this such and such an experience. It works scientifically. If you perform this experiment, then you will encounter these results, right? If you can drop something in a vacuum environment, you'll discover that it's accelerating at 9.8 meters per second squared. Similarly, if you follow the teachings of Buddha, you follow the Eightfold Path, then your experience of the world will be different. And so it creates a larger framework where it's not just differentiated like with the postmodernists, but it specifically says, yes, but now that you're looking at it, you can choose things. And it's like a reality tunnel. You're going into that tunnel. If you want to see this, if you want to get an experience of this, then this is a tunnel that you would go into. And since these are paradigms, these are injunctions that you can choose, you're essentially at a next level where you can choose, and you're not just in a tunnel, you're actually potentially in a labyrinth. because you realize that you can see things differently and you can start reshaping the reality tunnel so you can turn left, turn right, and so forth. So that process of a universalizing and then a differentiation going from third person, fourth person, and then fifth person or level is a unifying framework where you have a broader context and you have this idea of injunctions, which are very much reality tunnels. Each paradigm is an injunction, and if you follow that injunction, you experience phenomena at the level at which you're creating in that reality tunnel. What's the larger framework for that? In other words, you have something that's identified. It's like a field. Then it gets differentiated into tunnels. And there's a perspective that says we can't really evaluate any tunnel because when you're in a tunnel, anything that you're looking at is just looking at another tunnel. It's just another reality tunnel. And then there's a larger perspective that said each tunnel actually goes somewhere. So the question is, where do you want to go? And then you're almost overlooking or like choosing, like you have a map and you're walking through this system that actually goes from being a tunnel, just a tunnel, to being a maze. Like, did you know there's a portal up there on the left and you can go out? You can go to the left. So that's a labyrinth. And then there's another level that says that, like, yeah, but where is this labyrinth? Like, what is the larger structure wherein this labyrinth exists? How does this whole labyrinth hold together? And that would be the next level of second tier. And I would argue that seems to work with the idea of the bigger picture of the goal for the human race, because these are all aspects of the development of the capacities of human beings to affect, to be affected, to experience reality. So I think the case is pretty strong that we're at least up to the second level of second tier with this passage of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and the way that it can harmonize so well with the ideas of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. I think there's a strong affinity between this, the fourth way, and integral theory, where with a vision of establishing a type 1 civilization on this planet. It's like the culture of the Superman.
Right.
And if you take, like, in the readings of Ouspensky somewhere, when he talks about different levels of men, it says if there is a man number 7, that implies that the whole world has become a school. So it's interesting that if you look at the ideas of Gebser and you look at all the development in integral theory, with what Nietzsche is talking about, if you're actually going up that ladder, if you're going up those tiers, it's necessarily more transcendent, which entails being more inclusive. So Nietzsche, the way he's been read, has entailed this vision of this super being who is some sort of a subjugator. But really, when we put it in this context where it seems to work so well, there's an element of collectivism there.
Yeah.
Like going back with the passages where he wants to get away from the people, it's because he wants to get away from the distraction and noise of the chattering culture, but ultimately with the purpose to return. And that's part of his own individuation process. On the one hand, you got people that go to the friend to get away from themselves. On the other hand, you get people that want to get away from the flies in the marketplace, but not from a misanthropic perspective, but ultimately to return.
Yeah, there's definitely, on first reading the section on the flies of the marketplace, it definitely reads as misanthropic. But then, of course, as you said, Zarathustra ends up returning to the market. So that shows that something else is going on. And on your descriptions and so on of second tier and so on, it's really interesting. I mean, looking at the human development process, I mean, when you have integration and differentiation and then integration again, the whole thing basically looks like a loop, but there's actually a kind of teleological direction in the development so that each move, either in terms of integrating what is not integrated or differentiating what needs to be differentiated, each ends up being a move in the development process. And that teleological direction seems, in one way, it could be described as the Overman.
That upward drive, that kind of like being, pulled gravitationally, that could, it's almost like you could almost relate that to like the concrescence that Terence McKenna was always talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact of this human development and the systems that have been created to sort of outline or map it, the fact that it exists is extremely strange.
Yeah, I think that Wilber actually connected that upward movement, that drive upward, with Eros.
I see.
I mean, you have to admit, this is a very basic kind of issue that people have had for quite some time. If you have a model of the universe that's subject to entropy, how do you have these emerging levels of complexity?
Yeah.
And that's life.
Right.
That's life. As amazing as it is to think about it, so as beautifully complex as a star is, a cell is actually more complex than a star.
Right.
And a cell includes a star in the sense that the elements that are essential to life had to be created by dying stars.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought back the section on the flaws of the marketplace, because I had a few things that I wanted to say about it. To quote from the Kaufman translation, "Where solitude ceases, the marketplace begins. And where the marketplace begins, the noise of the great actors and the buzzing of the poisonous flies begins too. In the world, even the best things amount to nothing without someone to make a show of them. Great men the people call these showmen. Little do the people comprehend the great, that is, the creating. But they have a mind for all showmen and actors of great things." That's, first of all, it's hilarious. But,
yeah. It makes me think of action figures.
Yeah, there's this. I think we really should do a podcast on the conflation of the cool and the good.
Yeah, that's very important. I mean, that could actually lead to the end of humanity.
Right. And in that passage, Nietzsche is basically saying that rather than quality, they are happy with a kind of commotion.
Right. Which I think can be related back to the person seeking the friend to distract them from their kind of own internal mischief.
Right. It made me think of the notion of qualia. I think probably the best book on understanding that is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I was like immediately reminded of this sentence in that book where he goes to get his bike fixed and the kids at the repair shop misdiagnose and screw the bike up even worse. Piercing wrote, "They sat down to do a job and they performed it like chimpanzees."
I knew it. I was like, is that the passage where he talks they're like chimps? And I'm like, because I did read that a long time ago. And yeah, like a couple of chimps. Chimps may have actually done a better job. If you go by like our earlier discussion.
Right. So with that, instead of the truly good feelings that come with, knowledge and ability and getting a job done well in the marketplace, you get like a lot of razzmatazz acting and spectacles. And it's interesting that Nietzsche links the great with creating.
Oh, yeah. And I think that part of what people do when they esteem an actor or they esteem a representative of a creation or some principle is they distance themselves from the principle and just build a citadel of references to individuals.
Yeah.
Where you could say, like you could say the line, "Oh, yeah, he's like that person described in that song, bent out of shape by society's pliers. He cares not to come up any higher. He'd rather drag you down into the hole that he's in."
Right.
And then they'll say, "Oh, yeah, that's Bob Dylan." And that's like just the end of the conversation.
Right.
Not thinking about that social dynamic that is such an active feature in our lives.
Yeah.
I mean, even the idea of the Superman. A lot of people talk about the Superman. How many of them have actually read Nietzsche? Or, to even try to think about what we're talking about. How many people think Nietzsche is cool because he was Hitler's favorite philosopher?
Right.
So this does go back to what you were talking about with cool.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to get at, the main thing I wanted to get at with the section on the marketplace, kind of touched on that. Is a kind of misreading to understand it as like there being a lack of charity. I mean, he makes some good points that you could definitely see as overly cynical. Like, the world hoists fame onto people who pretend to be someone else rather than on the inventors of new values. The marketplace, and so I guess you could say the average person, is fast and overlooks everything and is shallow, that kind of thing.
Sounds like Jung's reading of Zarathustra.
It does.
I hate to say it. It's kind of, I found it a little bit disturbing.
Yeah. Being around, the average person is like, it's like you're shooing a fly. I mean, on the other hand, the average person, they may show some altruism. They might have experienced great hardships. They struggle like we struggle. It's really not really like shooing flies. But on the other hand, like you just mentioned, there are a lot of people that just want to keep you down or smack you down, have you down at their level so that they have someone to hang out with. There are people that act like these poisonous flies. And to move towards solitude is, well, that's the best move in such a situation.
Right. But it's kind of funny because I brought up that line as an example of something that you could gain some insight into society, and then people would just make the reference. But It's totally relevant to this particular passage, as you pointed out. And if you look towards the end, it says, before you they feel small, and their baseness glimmers and glows in invisible revenge.
Right.
Indeed, my friend, you are the bad conscience of your neighbors, for they are unworthy of you. They hate you and therefore would like to suck your blood.
Yeah, that happens,
Yeah,
So
it does.
We should not allow that to happen. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be cut down. You're familiar with Lawrence Alma-Tadema, right?
No.
He was a rather modern painter, I think 19th century, but he learned the ancient Roman painting techniques and he painted in that style. Like he was fabulous at painting marble and, the ancient Greek and Roman gods and that sort of thing. He painted a scene of this Roman king, Tarquin the Proud, or Tarquin the Proud, I'm not sure. The king secretly announced the way to conquer a city by way of show and tell. He went into his garden and he cut all the heads off the tallest poppies in the garden. And that was an instruction to kill the great men of the city. That technique, of course, has survived till today for doing all kinds of terrible things. But it's also come down to us as the tall poppy syndrome, which is the idea that great people in these cultures of resentment and small-mindedness will be cut down. And I have to just add, this is kind of funny and sad, but in Japan, and for people that have a kind of interest maybe in Japan, there's this tendency to go hunting for exclusively Japanese ideas that show how Japanese basically are supposed to be conformist drones. And there's this one Japanese proverb that everyone ends up using over and over again. That's typically translated as the crooked nail gets hammered down. So the way that people interpret that is basically if you're different than other people, Japanese culture will hammer you down until you're like everyone else. But the entire thing is nonsense. First of all, the Japanese for the proverb would be more accurately translated as not the crooked nail, but the protruding nail gets hammered down. So it's basically the exact same idea as the tall poppy syndrome. It's saying, don't be surprised if the rabble want to knock you down a bit. You get too big, too much status, whatever. And I think the British have an identical proverb. So, well, you've got these misguided ideas and groupthink going on to try to describe in other people as conformist drones. It's, it's quite ironic.
Right, right.
And even by talking about it, right, maybe I'm chewing flies when Zarathustra says that I should be off in the wilderness in the solitude. But I just living in Japan, I wanted to bring that up, and it's kind of interesting that the West, with its fantasy of this kind of pure, unbridled self-expression and freedom, needs to find the sort of opposite of that in some other culture, as if to prop up the fantasy.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, one way to summarize what you're saying is that the statement about the protruding nail being hammered down is misinterpreted by those who want to see Japanese culture as conformist to a pathological degree. It's seen as prescriptive when it's really descriptive. Right. It's describing. Yes. And in doing so, it's describing what really is part of, it's funny, we've been talking about postmodernism, but I don't want to necessarily say universal, but a widely experienced social dynamic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of funny that people would see Japanese culture as being so conformist and thus so sterile with respect to the imagination, and then they'll go watch a movie that was actually a remake of a Japanese movie. But yeah, that's absolutely true that, that kind of, when you're part of, when we're talking about the passage where it talked about the ultimate man or the final man, the point where people kind of agree to stop developing, and every time when they would get a glimpse of the instability and incompleteness of their reality, they blink. That to me is just part of that process, is having some kind of caricature of another person, whether that's a political enemy or something in another civilization where you esteem your civilization over that civilization, and in a sense, in doing so, just kind of project all the garbage of your civilization onto that one.
Yeah. So to become the overman, I think the shooing flies is a sort of waste of energy that will stop you from getting there. And you have to not allow anyone to stop you or to try to cut you down. So yeah, it really seems to me, right, that the tall poppy syndrome has a lot to do with this passage.
Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to mention related to that is that, of course, Zarathustra does come back to the marketplace. So there is a charity there when it seems like a very sort of cynical passage. And it seems like Zarathustra's return is sort of like retracing the steps of Bodhisattva.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, see, you and I were making those connections early on, and it could have been perceived as facile, given the framework of Ouspensky and so forth. But I think we've done a nice job of really looking into Nietzsche's writings and showing that connection is not just some facile move, that if you actually read Nietzsche carefully and also through the lens of integral theory, which we're so lucky to be alive now and to have this like absolutely brilliant material available to us, that we can see this clearly. Right. I mean, this is probably, some of it is his fault. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's not the best way to put it. It's just not as if his vision is perfect. But overall, the level of misinterpretation is really profound. But then again, I feel like a lot of that relates to that people don't even read him in the first place.
Right. So I was thinking about, I totally agree with the idea that Jesus was an overman. The way that I see Jesus is that he was a great man. It's kind of difficult to talk about these things, but okay, if you look at it in terms of waking up and growing up,
right.
Jesus grew up fully or to an extremely high degree, but then he also realized his own godhood, so he was also fully awake. It seems to me like he had both woken up and grown up.
That's possible. My only issue is that if he had that notion of, well, let me put it to you this way. So much of growing up really is expanding the perspective to, and, kind of transcending transcending your sense of identification, expanding the circle of compassion, moral consideration.
Yeah.
I think that he communicated that to a certain degree, but I'm not sure how clear it is. I mean, maybe it's just the way that it was rendered in the culture. I feel like, okay, well, I'll just throw this out there. You know, both Emerson and Thoreau were avid readers of texts like the Bhagavad Gita. And I can't remember if it was Emerson or Thoreau. I think it was Emerson. Emerson basically said, when I read the Bhagavad Gita, it clarifies. When I read the Bible, it's in need of clarification. So I do get the sense that Jesus, one, I find mythicist arguments interesting, but I'm inclined to believe that Jesus did actually exist. And from the things that he said, from the teachings I've been able to discern, that he had awakened and that he had reached within the context of waking up, that he had awakening all the way to non-dual. And that would explain statements like I and the Father are one, or like he who sees me has seen the Father. And the way that he was also trying to expand it. And also, you know, if you look at what the Jewish tradition is, they believe that every generation there's kind of an opportunity for the Messiah or Moshiach to come. And that actually part of it is really the people. In other words, if the people were all acting in the spirit of the Messianic age, the Moshiach would come. Or so, this is like one of the traditions. And in some sense, he was embodying that. He says, I am the Moshiach. Because if you don't do that, then you're basically always just like shrugging it off and essentially putting it off till tomorrow and saying that someone else is going to come along. I guess the thing is that it would be interesting if the Bible basically read like integral theory, and you know, do you know what I mean?
Right.
So like I could believe that, but you know, if he reached this level, but it was rendered according to the understanding of the people who were around him.
Right. Okay, let me describe a little bit more, and then I'll ask my question to you. Okay, so the way that I am seeing this, and now I've had some interesting experiences in movie theaters that I want to get to, I guess, a little later in the podcast. But just to sort of summarize, they were what I would call Superman or Overman experiences. And what that was a kind of a realization that I should work to better the world. And I contrast that with experiences I've had of like non-dual experiences where, you know, to put it basically the way that like a textbook would put it, there is no world to better. In a lot of experiences that I've had like that, the idea of bettering the world basically just doesn't even come up. Whereas with the Superman experiences, it basically is the sort of crux of the experience. And if you look at Jesus as the Superman, you see that he did try to better the world. So my question, is a very open question, but the Jesus story and the Bodhisattva story are very different, particularly with how the story ends. And I wonder what you think about that.
Well, one is the idea of somebody who stays, and the other one is somebody who leaves, right?
Right. That's exactly why I asked it.
Bodhisattva's like, I'm staying, you know, and he's like, no, I'm leaving. Bodhisattva stays. Bodhisattva says, I am man. Jesus said, I'm God, I'm leaving. I think part of it is, if you go into the Bible, I don't remember what the verse is, but I think there's a part where Jesus leaves. Part of it, he explains that the process of leaving is also allowing for the Holy Spirit to come. And that, in some sense, the establishing the church is the goal, and the church is like the satsang or the sangha. The church is the spiritual community. Here it says, it's John 14:26. Jesus tells his followers that the Father will send them the Holy Spirit. This advocate will come to teach and remind people about Jesus, for it comes in Jesus' name. So the thing is also, there's this idea of, I mean, I read this, we discussed this when we had Smoley on and we were talking about the theology of love, but this is John 10:30 to 37. I and the Father are one. Again, his Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him. But Jesus said to them, I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We are not stoning you for any good work, they replied, but for blasphemy because you, a mere man, claim to be God. Jesus answered them, Is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, the scripture cannot be set aside. Or he says, and the scripture cannot be set aside. What about the one whom the Father set apart as his very own and sent into the world? Why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? Well, he is here pointing to the idea that, yes, I am special. Yes, you want to kill me because I'm saying this, but it does say that you are gods, right? To whom the word of God came, you are gods. And on some level, I think you could interpret it as that's saying, I mean, this is almost like a something of a fortune cookie. But that's saying when you're ready, the teacher appears, and when you're truly ready, the teacher disappears.
Yeah, sometimes with your wallet.
Yeah, more often than not. I was watching this thing with John Oliver where he was exposing these televangelists who basically ask for what they call seed money. If you give them money, it's like you're planting a seed. Like one guy was like, maybe, you want a new house or something and you have $1,000. Well, you're not going to be able to get a new house for $1,000. So you may as well just give it to me. And maybe God will bless it. But I mean, here, like going back, one of the things I find so interesting about Zizek is, how he's good for these kind of counterintuitive statements, but when he's talking about the institution of the church. Now, whenever so often when people talk about the deeper meaning of something in the Bible or esoteric traditions, it's always has nothing to do with the church. It's really about your personal development and so forth. And he's saying, no, what really interests me is the institution of the church. And maybe there's something to that.
Yeah, I could see that for sure.
So there's another passage here that I want to talk about on the gift-giving virtue when he talks about good and evil. And he says, all names of good and evil are parables. They do not define, they merely hint. A fool is he who wants knowledge of them. Watch for every hour. Go ahead. I was going to, if you respond to that before I move on, if you want.
No, I was just going to say that what you're reading is part of a passage that I thought was my favorite in the whole couple of sections that we've been dealing with. If that's the case,
I have a lot to say about it, but why don't you read the passage and then make some comments, and then I can bring my ideas in, like I'll hear your ideas.
Okay, I didn't really prepare much. I just put the quote in some notes. Upward goes our way from genus to over genus. But we shudder at the degenerate sense which says, everything for me. Upward flies our sense. Thus it is a parable of our body, a parable of elevation. Parables of such elevations are the names of the virtues. Thus the body goes through history, becoming and fighting. And the spirit, what is that to the body? The herald of its fights and victories, companion and echo. All names of good and evil are parables. They do not define, they merely hint. A fool is he who wants knowledge of them. Watch for every hour, my brothers, in which your spirit wants to speak in parables. There lies the origin of your virtue. There your body is elevated and resurrected. With its rapture, it delights the spirit so that it turns creator and esteemer and lover and a benefactor of all things. When your heart flows broad and full like a river, a blessing and a danger to those living near, there is the origin of your virtue. When you are above praise and blame, and your will wants to command all things, like a lover's will. There is the origin of your virtue. When you despise the agreeable and the soft bed, and cannot bed yourself far enough from the soft, there is the origin of your virtue. When you will with a single will, and you call this cessation of all need necessity, there is the origin of your virtue. Yeah, there's a whole lot in there. One thing with this idea of good and evil being parables or hints, there's a sense that they're sort of illusions, and it's a fool who wants knowledge of them. It's like he wants to get to the source under the parable, which is kind of like, in Eastern thought, they talk about the finger pointing to the moon, or the many languages that are only words to describe the ineffable. I felt a little bit of a question when he describes them as hints, and then when it turns from good and evil to virtue, there's a kind of change where it isn't hints anymore, where it's like a kind of specific thing. I was a little confused by it, but if you have anything to say about that, or...
The way that I'm interpreting this is that, to relate it to Nietzsche's own thought, the images are associated with the Apollonian, and the birth of tragedy is associated with the dream image. The dream image is hinting at something. The image itself should not be rendered as some sort of objective truth. In the same sense that, in the birth of tragedy, Nietzsche is associating the image, Apollo, with the lyrical part of music, the lyrical poetry, and also the images and dreams. And, he had a concept of the music being this fundamental type of sublime chaos, and that you can set more than like one set of lyrics to a piece of music. The lyrics, in some sense, or the images, float on the music. The deeper primordial reality can be reached on some level through the image. The image actually is communicating something, but the order that's manifesting is just not condensable into that expression. In the process of a being who is evolving, a being who is developing, is those images will change. Dreaming the dream of a man, or dreaming the dream of an overman. The whole idea of waking up, which can include waking up in a dream, is that it's accessible at any stage of development. It can help to push your development forward to become more conscious on these more subtle levels of our being. But that it's not something that can really be crystallized. If it is crystallized, it only becomes a prison. Now, one of the things that's interesting that he talks about in The Birth of Tragedy is a kind of dialectical process. There's something in the interpretation of the image, and that establishes a level of order, a level of understanding. But then the Dionysian breaks through that again and establishes a new level of order. So there actually is something to the interpretive process, but a fool will crystallize it because it's actually all part of the process of the emergence. And this is also, I think, related to Nietzsche's affinity for Heraclitus, who called the world a river of fire. But what I think when it goes towards the virtues, I think that has to do with growing up.
Right. There's a really strange parallel to the two truths doctrine in this. To put it maybe oversimply, when you're looking at the things out there in the world, they are just objects, conventional objects to your conventional mind, but they also are always pointing to the absolute reality that the conventional mind cannot reach. And you could become obsessed and attached to any of the objects out there, and that would be you failing to realize what they're pointing.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. It reminds me of an experience where a student is meditating and he tells his master that he's had some visions, and he says the master basically tells him to just keep meditating and not worry about it too much.
Right.
The vision can actually point to something, right?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. There's also an element, I think, if you think about at least certain forms of practiced Christianity, they act as a cult of personality focused on Jesus. And that's something that I think also often happens, in that someone or something is pointing the way, and then you're like, oh yeah, you're really great. And then, it just becomes about that person rather than what they're trying to.
Which, if you go back, that's addressed in The Flies of the Marketplace.
Is it? I forgot.
Yeah, he talks about the actor.
Oh, right.
It's really, it ends up being about the actor associated with what he was communicating. I mean, Einstein is a perfect example. I was telling you, people say oh, someone got a higher IQ score than Einstein, even though Einstein never took an IQ test. And it's like all, it's Barbie dolls. It's all plastic. It's all Einstein occupying a place in someone's mind. Someone beat Einstein, even though they didn't actually do anything. How many people really have much understanding of what Einstein even said?
Yeah, not many.
I feel like I'm just scratching the surface, but I'm trying to understand it.
Right.
That's absolutely the case. So that whole process of image and being attached to that image, yeah, I definitely think that is a factor. It's just not condensable down to what you translate it to. What you translate it to will always bear the image. It will always have the stamp of the stage of development that you're at. What I do think is interesting, though, is if you reflect upon things in as a higher level you're capable of reaching, you can actually change the way that you see things, and you can evolve through that process. And that's what I find is so interesting. Like in The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, he quotes this line from Wagner. Actually, I only have the German here. I'll just read it. It's Mein Freund, das Grad ist Dichters Werk, das sein Träumen deut und merkt. Which is, my friend, frankly, that is the work of the poet, that he notices and he interprets his dreams.
Yeah. I quoted Picasso in my book that's coming out this year. It's a great quote, and I think it really fits here. Let me see. Picasso said, "We all know that art is not truth. Art is a lie that makes us realize the truth, at least the truth that is given to us to understand."
Bullseye. Bullseye. I think that's exactly what Nietzsche was talking about. And I think that part of Nietzsche's vision that he developed in The Birth of Tragedy is at work here in this passage of Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Nietzsche's beliefs about the importance of art.
Right. Well, I mean, really, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music is really a vision of not just art as art, but the beginning of his working on his philosophy of living life as art. As a living life as a work of art. And then we already talked about the kind of postmodern implications of his ideas, and then ideas, looking at integral implications. So it's like this work of art that also has these ruptures and collapses in it, and some Dionysian element that on the one hand is destroying it, on the other hand is fructifying it and expanding it. And so thinking about the Dionysian, the Dionysian breaks the Apollonian mold related to your civilization, your state of conditioning, your present level of development. And it's this music, and there's music beneath the lyrics, and other lyrics could be put to that music, right? Carmina Burana can be the soundtrack to a low-level horror movie like The Omen, or it can be like a moment of after Parsifal finds the Grail and brings it to Arthur, and Arthur says, "Have you found the secret of the Grail?" And he says, "Yes." "What is it?" "The you and the land are one." And he gives the Grail to Arthur, and Arthur drinks it. And then you see the land, the darkness dispels, and the flowers begin to bloom, and the horses are, the knights are off to battle back the evil. It's a different movie. because it reached a new level. And in that particular case, it involved a realization, you and the land are one, which is actually a very strong theme in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And that whole process, I absolutely think you're right that this relates to the two truths. I think it puts a lot of emphasis on the co-creation process. But we're co-creating unconsciously most of the time. It's a strange kind of thing that you take the world as a given, and I think I'll be interested to hear what you say about this, because this is kind of occurring to me in real time. We take the world just as given, not acknowledging the co-creative role that we're playing in creating this world. And in a sense, the world as given really is just what the world is, because our whole co-creative process has been unconscious and automatic, and that was nothing but a playing out of stuff that was inculcated into us by the world. But as the capacity awakens, you begin to see things differently, and the reaching into the integral, realizing that there is some degree of choice. Nietzsche repeatedly uses, terms like being chosen, but being chosen is actually through choosing. And the vision of injunction, right, that we talked about before, where you're moving from this kind of like fourth person meta system differentiation of the different worldviews and aperspectivism in terms of no ground to stand on to really assess a worldview, a reality tunnel, because you're in one, so it's just that from the perspective of that reality tunnel, to a higher order, fifth person, unified framing, broader context, paradigmatic, injunction, follow the injunction, and see. You end up moving towards this, and then there's an even higher order where you're moving through labyrinths of tunnels. This is the creative capacity of, this is the Apollonian as like radical cinematic creator realm, right? This is the world of the Superman entails moving from a reality tunnel to a reality labyrinth that contains all the tunnels to a larger reality that contains the labyrinth itself. And in a sense where I think on a certain level, I was a little disappointed with what you shared with me about Jung and Zarathustra. The vision of Zarathustra, I think, is going a little bit further. And when I think about Wilber's critique of Jung in terms of what he considers to be the true archetypes as the first forms, I think that would be more critical in understanding the larger reality that contains the labyrinth itself.
Right. Yeah, well, on the idea of the music and then changing the lyrics over it, there's something really interesting, maybe you could say in a converse way, with the subtleties of what Laibach engages in. One example, of course, a lot of the cover songs that they have done, the way that Laibach performs them, you could say basically the same music, but the music is changed or looked at from a different angle, heard from a different angle, I guess you could say. And the lyrics are the same, but it somehow brings out new meanings and new ambiguities.
I remember listening to Laibach cover of Pink Floyd, Dogs of War, and it was only listening to Laibach's cover where I said, this is actually a great song. I think that what they're doing is part of that reflection upon the dream image. In other words, they're the poet. They're a poet interpreting the images of the dreams, and in doing so, they're raising the level that allows the next Dionysian rupture, if you will.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the things that, I could keep going on about Laibach for hours, but they made this, I guess you could call it a message that they've sent out in various ways. It's just so Laibach. They say, if you don't like our music, turn around 360 degrees and go.
Yeah. Reminds me, I just thought of that song where it says, "We are no ordinary group. We are no humble pop musicians. We don't seduce with melodies. We're not here to save your soul." And something like, "But we can question your demands."
They're super interesting.
But if you put it in the context that we're talking about, yeah, they would be the dream shifter. They, in some sense, would be like Morpheus in the Matrix, showing you that you're living in a dream world. Revealing, I think they really accomplish a lot of what Zizek talks about, where he's saying that we're actually more ideological than ever, because we've fallen into this state of just how unconsciously we're acting out ideology all the time. And so when Laibach takes a piece of music and they show what, like the implicit underlying structure is, that is a type of world dream psychoanalysis. When people talk about how Freud, they talk about how Nietzsche really anticipated Freud, the birth of tragedy, that's really the beginning of, it's probably other works, so, but that's really, you really see that idea.
Right.
I'd like to read a little bit about the real archetypes. This is an excerpt from Wilber. From the Neoplatonic traditions in the West to the Vedanta and Mahayana and Trikaya traditions in the East, the real archetypes are subtle seed forms upon which all of manifestation depends. In deep states of contemplative awareness, one begins to understand that the entire cosmos emerges straight out of emptiness, out of primordial unity, out of Nirguna Brahman, out of the Dharmakaya, and the first forms that emerge out of this emptiness are the basic forms upon which all lesser forms depend for their being. Those forms are the actual archetypes, a term which means original pattern or primary mold. There is a light of which all lesser lights are pale shadows. There is a blitz of which all lesser joys are anemic copies. There is a consciousness of which all lesser cognitions are mere reflections. There is a primordial sound of which all lesser sounds are thin echoes. These are the real archetypes. When we find those types of statements in Plotinus or Asanga or Garab Dorje or Abnivigupta or Shankara, rest assured that those are not simply theoretical hunches or metaphysical postulates. Those are direct experiential disclosures issuing directly from the subtle dimensions of reality, interpreted according to the backgrounds of those individuals, but issuing from this ontological reality, this world space. And if you want to know what these men and women are actually talking about, then you must take up the contemplative practice or injunction or paradigm and perform the experiment yourself. These archetypes are the true archetypes, are a meditative experience, and you cannot understand these archetypes without performing the experiment. They are not images existing in the mythic world space. They are not philosophical concepts existing in the rational world space. They are not meditative phenomena existing in the subtle world space. Oh, they are meditative phenomena existing in the subtle world space. I was chopping everything with a sword. So this experiment will disclose these archetypal data, and then you can interpret what they mean. And by far, the most commonly accepted interpretation is you are looking at the basic forms and foundations of the entire manifest world. You are looking directly into the face of the divine. As Emerson said, bid the intruders to take the shoes off their feet, for here is the God within.
Well, I've been performing that experiment, but my controls must be poor or something because I haven't gotten there.
Well, the way that we're talking about the dream imagery and everything,
Yeah.
it makes it sound like on all these movies where it's like, no, we're going to like the super theater and they're not actually showing a movie there, and we meditate and like fly around, we fly into the source.
Yeah.
I think that if you look at the birth of tragedy and you interpret what they're talking about, and thus spoke Zarathustra, I see this vision of the injunctions as showing the world of the Superman. But I know what you mean. I know what you mean. I mean, I have friends who meditate. They're telling me all these, it's so elaborate. And like, I'm going to do this and then I do that and I stimulate my pineal gland and da-da-da-da. And when I meditate, I'm basically just trying to bring myself back, realizing I was planning something or fantasizing a revenge. And I was like, wait a minute. I'm supposed to be meditating. No, it's kind of interesting though, because even when that happens and I come back and I still feel like there's been a fundamental shift. Even though I got caught up in a tangle of thoughts again, I extricate myself. That process of noticing that you got caught and extricating yourself, that is meditation. And the thing is that I do notice like I actually like to practice meditation lying down flat. And I start to feel almost like my body is, at first I'm becoming much more aware of my body. And then I really start to feel like my body is being absorbed into a kind of fundamental field, which again is a matter of interpretation of what that means. On a certain level, if you have an experience that you say, you interpret it as I had an experience of oneness, I was beyond thought, or what have you. Those are ultimately, they're not necessarily reducible to it, but there are physiological states that are connected to that. And Nietzsche seems very adamant about the fact that the foundation of that experience is the body. I mean, even if you're having an experience where you seem to, like, you begin to feel like your body, it's like it's becoming part of this overall fundamental hum, like some sort of fundamental energy, that might not be losing the body. That might actually be like a moment of actually becoming aware of the body on a deeper level, because like your body itself is that as a kind of fundamental hum. You go back to the idea of a cell as a union of metabolism and membrane. There's a kind of, a relating to itself quality, which is fundamental to life.
Yeah. It's strange to me, I made the connection between Nietzsche and the Two Truth doctrine before. And Nietzsche did engage with Buddhism, and I'd like to go more deeply into his ideas about it in another podcast. But that idea of realizing a kind of oneness and so on really seems connected to the Dionysian.
Absolutely, yeah. It says that it's somewhere in the birth of tragedy where it talks about man and nature, like having that experience. I mean, when people are going back into nature, revelry, now with the image of wine and everything and orgies and so forth, and it can even become violent. That's also like the primary process, fundamental drives, chaos, destruction, childbirth, insanity, barbarians, Cossacks.
Right. Yeah,
Sure.
I want to quote two things from The Birth of Tragedy. One is just in that vein. He talked about divisions disappearing in the Dionysian, and to quote him, each one feels himself not only united, reconciled, and fused with his neighbor, but as one with him. So there's really this sense in which I think Nietzsche's work does kind of map onto, if not Eastern thought, then consciousness practices and the idea of states and stages.
Go back and look at the idea of the rational, where they had the insight of, like this idea of universality. And then postmodernists came along and said, yes, but you have to differentiate this because there's the perspective of those other individuals, not just you feeling one with them, because there can even be a narcissistic regressive aspect to that if it's interpreted incorrectly. the Apollonian Dionysian process, when they talk about integral theory in terms of a unification and then a higher level differentiation, when he talks about the boundaries dissolving in the Dionysian, that's a unification. And then if you emerge from the experience, but you're transformed in some way by the experience, and you are distinguishing and you are evolving, then you are actually more differentiated than you were before the experience. And then, but preparing for the next level of integration. It's kind of like the pre-trans fallacy. You know, people who just want to go back to this kind of unity, not understanding that the state of unity itself is growing through the strands evolving in their different way, so that when they're woven back together again, it's a higher state of reality. Just like the process of going through all these movies is helping to create, like, lay the ground for a greater movie.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll follow that up with the second quote that I wanted to use from The Birth of Tragedy. This is probably one of my top 3 lines in the book. The Apollonian artist, Nietzsche wrote, is absorbed in the pure contemplation of images. The Dionysian musician lacks any image and is in himself only and entirely the original pain and original reverberation of that image.
It maps perfectly to what Wilber is talking about, but it isn't quite as tantalizing. But I feel like that goes back to the differentiation, that the individual is there, and until you go down to that deeper level, you know, and experience that pain, which is almost, it's like the doctrine of surrealism, where, like, there's a kind of like being at the leading edge of the world, being kind of like, or being totally alone, or going insane in a hotel room somewhere, but you also are the world, in that, like, you're actually pushing that forward, that, you know, even in some way mapping to some things that Charles Manson said. You know, he did have a type of cultural philosophy, that the philosophy basically being, like, a lot of the culture that we're living in is actually created in the prison, and in some sense, it can be in the the alchemical chamber of solitary confinement. I mean, you could see Charles Manson interviews. You know, I think it was with Penny Daniels, where, you know, he's like, "Ah!" You know, he just makes these like noises and things. Where he's, you know, he's telling her, like, this is the, you know, fundamental hum, and, you know, she's of course incredulous. But there is something to that. But I also think that there's something to framing this exactly the way we're framing it here, as kind of having an element of the abject, of the pathetic, because I think that that's part of the sublime. It's rooted in it.
Right.
It's growing through it.
So, did you have any other Nietzsche
No,
stuff
I'm actually
that you
kind
to
of
bring
curious
up,
to hear about your experience in the theater. And I feel like it wasn't even intentional, a lot of theater reference and imagery woven into this discussion.
Right. Okay. Well, so earlier I had talked about the Superman as a person who has gone beyond their culture by waking up and growing up to a higher degree than the culture, and how they might use that to try to change the world for the better. The idea of Jesus or the Bodhisattva. And I think I mentioned that I had experiences watching movies in theaters that gave me a sense, I felt a sort of imperative to grow myself, to improve the world. So that's like basically the starting point of what I wanted to talk about with those experiences. And, well, for about 5 years, I worked on a book on the films of Dario Argento. And one of its main premises is that film as art is a way to get at something realer in life. And that seems to have opened something up for me, because every time I go to a theater to watch a movie, I end up having a very strange and powerful experience. This has been going on for about a year now. in those experiences, I start to feel very deeply the pain of the world, and I can self-investigate at a deeper level than I usually am able to do because I become more open, less self-limiting. There's a lot of fluidity in the situation. Like huge aspects of my life could just change at that very moment. Like I could shoot up into a greater stage. But also there's this sense where I feel like I could succumb to the greater pain that I feel during that time and either try to just dull myself to dull the pain, or that like I could actually slip instead of shooting up into a greater stage. I could just fall perhaps into insanity.
Well, I hear you.
And so they're so much different than the states I experience in meditation, which is kind of like changing the way that you experience. These experiences in the theaters feel so much more like becoming the Superman of growing up, and then after having grown up to try to pull other people up. Well, this is really autobiographical, but one thing that happens and has happened every time in these experiences is a bunch of darkness seeps in, just a whole lot of negativity, like everyone I love becoming rotting flesh. And I can deal with negativity. Like I see the vision of my children dying and I think, yeah, of course we will all die. And then I see shitty things I've done in my life and I say, yes, I've done bad things. It's just like, okay, get on with it. But basically the negativity never ends. I'm just barraged with it continuously. And the first time I had this experience, I was just like, okay, well, that was interesting, but it was really uncomfortable and bad. And I thought about it a lot. And then the second time it happened, I was able to get away from the negativity a little bit, maybe sort of put some distance between myself and it and analyze it. And I was like, okay, so why are these endless negative thoughts happening? And I realized that I was being given the gift of seeing my own sickness.
I wonder how many people out there recognize what you're talking about, because it's so important. It's so important because when you start waking up and you start seeing these patterns and all the garbage and those moments that are, it can be overwhelming. And I think that's one of the reasons that there's a type of impediment to waking up, because basically people turn away from it.
Yeah, I definitely felt, well, the way I described it to myself is that I was contracting, that there was a contraction away from it. So I started to investigate, my own sickness. And that is when I started to see a sort of beautiful path in front of me. And this isn't like visual, but just a sort of mental representation of this path of, and the phrase came to me at that moment, integral health. And it sounds like such a small thing, but I mean, I just had this fundamental realization down to my core that I had to replace my bad habits with good habits to be on that path, And before these experiences, thinking about habits, I was just kind of like, whatever, I've got this big habit, no big deal. But in the experience, I realized in a way that life is made out of habits. And so the habits are actually kind of the entire deal. That if you have bad habits, you are sick. And if you have good habits, you will become healthy. And to make that switch, you feel weak and you feel resistance and you don't want to change. And then you have to realize that your idea of following in the footsteps of the Superman is a fucking joke.
Well, I have realized that.
So then I start to feel almost a kind of spiritual desperation or longing. And I want to ask for the power to become healthy. And I want to have this sort of tremendous bravery that is required to move forward, to grow. And at that point, there might be a little bit of too much negative shading to this, but there's a sort of kernel of truth in it that I started to feel like I'm hiding away in a career when I could do so much more. And then thinking about that, the shades of the experience became a little bit lighter. And I started to think about potential, about all of our potential. What happens if we actually do grow and if we actually do wake up? Then how much are we actually capable of? Earlier, you said that awakening always involves pain, but change is the only way. Change or growth is truth, and everything else is lies. So these kinds of Superman experiences that I've been having in movie theaters, I thought that it would be kind of important to share it here, because this isn't academic theory or stories we're passing around. It's completely real, and I think it's basically the most important thing in the human world. So do you want to just try to wing the outro and see what happens?
Yeah, I think winging the outro is a good idea.
We could say, if we were going to record an outro, then maybe we should say this and that.
Yeah, like you've been listening to Phenomenoumena with co-hosts Ray, I am he.
And Gino. Yeah, well, we could do it like that.
Yeah, and then we could direct them to all the places where the podcast would be found. Spotify, iTunes, wherever they are. And, check out our webpage, Phenomenoumena.com. What about using this? Can we use this?
Yeah, I think maybe we should use this.